Thank you for coming to today's presentation. Today's presentation is by Dr. Cheryl Watson, PhD, on how environmental hormone impersonators disrupt signaling in your cells. And we'd like to invite you to fill out our survey at the end of the presentation. Dr. Watson is a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. She is a research expert in the various mechanisms by which steroid hormones and other chemicals that imperfectly mimic them act in cells. She studies these effects in both normal and cancer cells from breast, prostate, pituitary, and the nervous system and the immune system. She has worked independently in this field for over 25 years since completing her PhD and postdoctoral training. She has authored over 100 scientific papers and has organized, chaired, and spoken in many scientific programs and symposiums. She teaches the cell biology of protein targeting and endocrinology in MD and PhD students and directs the research training of PhD students. Okay, Dr. Watson.
Hi everyone, welcome to our island, both literally and figuratively and virtually. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you about how chemicals in our environment can impersonate hormones and disrupt the signaling that goes on between your cells. That is very important for the operation of all kinds of systems in your body. So what I'm going to tell you about today is in this outline. For those who don't understand a lot of the basics of cell biology, I'm going to tell you what a cell is and what the nature of the hormone signals are. I'll focus on estrogens. They're the main ones that I work on. Then we'll talk a little bit about what diseases or birth defects can stem from being exposed to these chemicals, and specifically what the mechanism is of how these chemicals disrupt your estrogen signals. And then finally, I'm going to tell you about hopefully what we can do about this in the future to preserve our health. Okay, so first, what is a cell? And so a cell is the smallest living unit that many of which then make up tissue, and finally an organ, and an organ system, and then an organism. In my lab, we specifically work at this cell level, and we work on cells, a variety of different kinds of cells, from pituitary, brain, breast, prostate cancer, and white blood cells. So what is a hormone? And so I have cartoons here of cells. I have a blue cell and a yellow cell. And you can see going between these cells are indications by little geometric symbols and also some actual real chemicals of signals going between those cells. So hormones are natural chemicals in your body that message from one cell or organ to another. We call this science endocrinology, or we study the endocrine system. And endo, as you can see on my slide, means inside the body, and crine means a message. So this is messages inside the body. What kinds of messages do cells send to each other? It might be grow faster, make something, shut down another cell, or inhibit the actions of another hormone. Those are the kinds of chemical messages that are traveling between cells. Okay, so there are also human-made chemicals that are in all kinds of products, which I'll show you in a minute, and that get into the environment, and they're very similar to the natural chemical signals, and therefore they can interrupt signaling in your body, and those we call endocrine disruptors. And you are likely exposed to many of these. Even if you try to control your environment, there are lots of things that are out there contaminating the environment that can hijack the signals from your hormone. Okay, so this then shows you a picture of many of the kinds of consumer products that have these kinds of chemicals in them. You see lots of things like plastic bottles, plastic bags, and various things that get into the environment, shown here with this plastic bag around a bird. There are also pesticides, shown by an airplane spraying pesticides over a field. You can also see pictures in the second row, starting over at the right, of personal care products like shampoos, flame retardants, things that are in paints and stains. A really big source are receipts that you get, paper receipts that have that powdery stuff on the surface of them. Also dental resins. And to the far left, the linings of lots of different kinds of cans and some pipes. Many cosmetics have these chemicals in them. And you can see an airplane traveling over a large body of water. That refers to the fact that it's spreading things like dispersants, oil dispersants, and so we have a lot of that in the Gulf of Mexico right now. And then you see lots of different bottles of things, indicating that there are lots of household items and cleaners that contain these products. In the bottom right, you can see that this is a waterway that's jam-packed with all kinds of these consumer products as waste, and so our waterways are really loaded with this stuff. Okay, so there won't be a test at the end, but I wanted to give you a list of the actual names of these chemicals because you might recognize some of them from newspaper or magazine or internet articles. So I have the list of the name of the type of compounds in the blue text, and then what kinds of products those are in the green text. There are lots of pharmaceuticals out there that pass through human bodies and then go into the water system through the waste treatment. And an example of that would be ethinyl estradiol, which is one of the main ingredients of birth control pills. And it can't be taken out of the water supply in waste treatment plants, so there's actually an awful lot of ethinyl estradiol in our water supply. Phthalates are things that are often in plastics and personal care products, and they actually make plastics softer, and a lot of those are in cosmetics as well. The PBDEs are flame retardants. Lots of consumer products have those. There are PFCs that are in stains and polishes and pesticides. There are PCBs and dioxins that are used in a lot of manufacturing processes and are in pesticides. Tributyltin and things that are related to it are part of wood and marine paint preservation products. Alkyl phenols are a really big class, and if you've heard of the plastic BPA, that is one of the alkyl phenols, and I'll talk about another one as I go on. Also, those oil spill dispersants have alkyl phenols in them, and they're used in lots of types of manufacturing. Chlorinated pesticides are still around. Even though some of them have been banned, they stay in the environment for a very long time. There are also fungicides and herbicides and even some heavy metals that act like hormones. So that's kind of the rogues list of them. Among these compounds that act like hormones, many of them, a major category of them, act like estrogens. And that's the way they do their endocrine disruption, and that's what my lab works on. And so let's just define for you what an estrogen is. It's a very small molecule. It signals all over the body, though certainly it's best known for signaling in female reproductive organs. It actually has an awful lot of other purposes. And so you can see that it's a relatively small molecule. You can see things hanging off of the carbon phenols base of it, and that's going to become important in a minute. So this slide shows the estradiol molecule that I showed you in the previous slide is right in the middle of that red circle. And next to it are a couple of other estrogens that are natural estrogens. There are actually quite a few of them. So those are the natural ones that are inside the red circle. Now if you look at the ones below, the birth control pill estrogen is the one on the left. Another birth control hormone is on the right, you can see that overall they look very similar to those natural estrogens, but there are a few different things hanging off of the edges. So you can see at the top above the red oval, there's a compound called nonylphenol, and that's one of the things that's in those oil dispersants. And you can see that it looks kind of like the estrogens. And if you thought about the size and shape of the molecules, they're similar. Bisphenol A is the one on the right, and sometimes you have to imagine maybe twisting it in a different position, and if you did that, you would see that it also is the same size and almost the same shape as an estrogen. You can see that it has those two OHs hanging off the ends, and you can see that the natural estrogens have that too. So estrogens look kind of alike, but they're not exactly the same. Okay, so while we usually think of estrogens as a major category of hormones that are made by the ovaries, and that means women, men and boys have estrogens too, though less, and they're made in other organs. And so this is just a graph showing you the physiologic levels of estrogens in males and females at different stages of development. And so you can see the male and female symbols on there. The reds and blues and greens are actually in women, and the gray lines and symbols are in men. And you can see that they have far less estrogens than women, but they're still measurable on this scale, and that's enough to do things in the body. In the far right, at the upper right of the graph, you can see some X's, and those are levels of estrogens in women during pregnancy, so they go way, way up. But these hormone receptors that sense these hormones are very, very sensitive, so they can still sense these very low levels of estrogens that are in men. And so what do estrogens control in women and men and boys and girls? What kinds of things are at risk if we interrupt their signaling? And so this is a list of what you need estrogens for. Everybody knows that you need them for reproduction, but they're also very important for development of many kinds. For instance, bone growth and strength. The heart and the circulatory system need estrogens to function properly. They certainly have an effect on the brain, changing mood and alertness. And the skin, in the skin they prevent aging, and they also have an effect on the immune system. Well, what happens if you have too much of these estrogens, or what we're talking about here, more importantly, the wrong kinds of estrogens? And so this is just a list of things that can go wrong. You can have cancer of many tissues that have receptors for these estrogens. Birth defects also result, so those are mistakes in development. You can have blood clots. It's thought that estrogens and some other hormones being disrupted relate to obesity and other kinds of metabolic disorders, even nausea and eating disorders. Certainly they can cause behavioral changes, so things like mood disturbances and addictions. Asthma is also a result of the wrong estrogens and your exposure to them, and autoimmune diseases. So you can see that you need a really balanced and highly regulated amount of exposure to estrogens, or things can go wrong. So kids are especially susceptible to endocrine disruptors because of the effects on development, especially for sex organs, the brain, and metabolism. And so I'm going to show you just a few examples of what can go wrong. So the first example on this slide, called cryptorchidism, or undescended testicles, you might have heard of that before. The diagram shows the progress during development of the testicles in development as they move through the body and down into the scrotum finally at the end of development. But if you interrupt that development, they can stay in any of those positions leading to the bottom position. And so that is actually a fairly common occurrence in humans, 1 to 10% of live male births. The next one is called hypospadias, and this is another developmental scenario. And you can see on the diagram we have various positions that happen during development of the urethra ending, eventually ending up with the opening of the urethra being at the tip of the penis. But if you block development somewhere along that path, you can have the tip of the urethral opening being somewhere along the line. And that's a fairly common birth defect as well. In girls especially, the timing of puberty is getting altered, and it's not all due to nutritional changes that we have in our modern world. And interruptions of thyroid hormone and estrogen signaling can also change metabolism that can lead to obesity. And so this is just a few of the things that are now being attributed to these compounds causing interruption of your hormonal signaling. It's also true that lab animals and very likely pet animals and certainly wildlife are susceptible to these effects. Here you can see a frog that has undergone some kind of disruption of its development, and it has 3 hind legs. On the right you can see an egg that has a very thin shell that is very easily broken. That is certainly an effect of some of these environmental estrogens that we've seen in the past. So now let's talk about the signals that cells send and receive on their receptors. And so this diagram again shows these 2 cells, a blue one and a yellow one. And now you see on the surface of them a little rectangle that is receiving that geometric symbol that represents a signal going between the 2 cells. So these receptors receive these signals on cells, and they keep everything organized and respond to new situations that the body normally needs hormones to tell them about. So hormone signals are kind of like keys that fit into a lock, and so the lock would be the receptor. There are lots of different hormones, or mimics of hormones, and so you can see lots of keys here in this diagram, and they will fit more or less into a receptor, but they might give slightly different results. And another diagram I have here that a cartoon that represents that, you can see that in the lower left-hand corner, the lock is shown just by a geometric shape that has an opening, and you can see that the yellow or the red hormone would not fit into that lock, but the blue one would. That triangular shape would fit into the lock. But you see just to the right of that also would another molecule that has the right shape for fitting into the lock but is extended would also fit. And then you see the little monsters on the right-hand side of the slide at the bottom that also have parts of their shape that would fit into that receptor. But obviously, by their characterization here, you can see they may be doing some disastrous things that a normal hormone wouldn't be doing. And this is to show you a diagram or a cartoon of a cell with receptors on its surface. And you can see that the hormone is the orange symbols that would fit into those receptors, and then it would cause a response in the cell. But when endocrine disruptors are around, those are the green symbols in the picture below that, you can see that they have the same shape, and they could also fit into those receptors, and that would cause a couple of different things. First of all, they would fit into the receptors and they might cause a slightly different response, or they might happen at the wrong time during development because they might be present and we might absorb them through our environment or our food. And finally, they would actually block the ability of the normal hormone to bind on that receptor. So that's how they interrupt the signaling of hormone receptors. And so I thought some of you might like to look at a real picture of what these receptors look like on cells. And this happens to be a pituitary cell that I work on. And there are 3 cells in this picture, and you can tell that because the dark purple circle is the nucleus of the cell, and then all the little red spots around it are the receptors that are on the surface of those cells. And if you actually twisted this picture in 3 dimensions, you could see that those red dots are actually on the surface of those cells. So you can see there are lots of them, and they're very heterogeneously distributed around on the cell, and certainly it varies quite a bit from one kind of cell to another. but these happen to be estrogen receptors on the surface of a pituitary cell. So, environmental estrogens and other hormones, they hijack the endocrine system by binding to the receptors, and these receptors are very, very sensitive. That means they work just about like hormones. They can be present in very low amounts and bind to these receptors. In the past, this wasn't understood so well, and so people only tested high doses of those compounds in the environment. And paradoxically, when you put way too much of a hormone onto a receptor, sometimes it even shuts down the response because it's overloading the cell with signals. So a lot of the tests we did in the past with only high doses really weren't very good tests for how these compounds work because they work in very small amounts. So what we have to do as researchers is to look very carefully at any suspect compound at a wide range of concentrations from very low to very high so that we can really understand at what exposure level it might be turning on signals or shutting off signals. And is signaling just a simple linear cascade of things? No, it isn't. As I've alluded to, there are lots of different hormones going between cells, and it gets much more complicated because they're all going at the same time. And by the same token, a lot of these compounds that mimic hormones are present in the environment in lots of combinations. So it's actually a web of signaling in the cell. Lots of different kinds of signals are going on at the same time. And this, had we been able to animate it, I'm sorry I wasn't able to animate it. Signaling is very, very complicated, but you can see here there's a website, and if you go look at this diagram on this website, you can see that every place here that you see a blue ball, it would be moving throughout this machine, and it would give you the sense of that a lot of the signaling is going on all at the same time, the web of signaling. And so these compounds are present in the environment all at the same time. So not only should you be looking at the one blue ball in that diagram of lots of blue balls moving around, but they would all be going on at the same time together. So if we had other hormones represented by these other colors, then it would be a huge web of signaling going on at the same time. So that's the problem. So what are we going to do about it in the future? And this is one thing that me and my fellow scientists in this area have given a lot of thought to lately. Environmental estrogens that I worked on recently are the kinds that are in those plastic bottles. This is bisphenol A, or BPA, you may have heard it called in the past. And they're very plentiful in products like plastics, resins, food packaging and coatings, and those cash register receipts, the powdery stuff that's on the cash register receipt. And this is one that we caught on to a few years ago, and we're very aware that BPA is causing an awful lot of these endocrine disruption things. So what are we going to do about it? Well, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this problem, 94% of Americans have levels of this compound in their systems, in their blood and their urine, at levels that can cause some of the effects that we see in our experiments. So we should stop using these chemicals, right? We know they're estrogenic, but we need some of the products that they're currently in. What about trying some substitutes? And so those of you that were aware that BPA is something you shouldn't be putting in your body may have searched for some products lately that are free of it. And so you see lots of things like you see here in this picture that are labeled now BPA free. Great, isn't that great? I went out and bought some of those BPA free things when these first came out myself. But did you ever ask yourself what's there instead of the BPA? Something had to be substituted. And so chemists invented a new molecule. It looks very similar to the old one. It can do the same job in products, for instance, for making plastics and paper coatings. And so on the left here you see BPA, and on the right you see the chemical that they've often been substituting for BPA recently. And it's called BPS because it has a sulfur in the middle of the molecule instead of a carbon. Do those look alike? Might they be keys that fit into the same receptor lock? Well, we thought so, and so we decided to test them. Unfortunately, nobody checked this out before the BPS got put in as a substitute in those products. We tested it, and it was quite like an estrogen. Too late. Now it's everywhere. 97% of humans now contain enough of this BPS substitute chemical to cause these responses. So, what are we going to do to prevent this happening again? All right, so there's this group of green chemists and biologists that do hormone signaling that are teaming up to try to eliminate these accidental environmental hormones. But we want to do it at the outset, when the chemicals are first being designed and discovered, before they get put into consumer products. And so how are we going to do that? It's kind of hard because biologists and chemists are actually trained very differently, and they have completely different kinds of education, completely different vocabularies, so they just don't speak the same language all the time. So we had to first grapple with that situation. So here are some of the things that we did to try harder to talk between biologists and chemists to get at this project. The first time we met together, we actually met at a cooking school, and we cooked some things together, and that's kind of interesting because most people that do biology and chemistry understand that it's a lot like doing experiments in cooking, and so it was kind of an appropriate exercise, and by doing that, it was a good icebreaker. We got to know each other. Many of us had never met each other before. So after we met each other in that informal way, we started giving each other access to our courses that we teach online, or creating courses online. For instance, the kind of courses that you give to beginning college students. And so we actually took each other's courses so that we could begin to understand the goals and the language a little better from each other. Then we met a couple of times together, and we asked and answered questions of each other and worked out a lot of disagreements, as is shown here on this cartoon. So we had to have lots of conversations. Then after we got past that part, we actually began to create some things together. We published papers that discussed our issues together. We wrote some grants together. We made websites. And finally, after all of that, we began to design a set of tests for various kinds of actions of these compounds at different levels, which I'll explain in a minute. And we started explaining them to mixed groups of scientists to make sure we understood each other. And so this just shows our list, in a cartoon fashion, our list of tests, which we called, and I'll show you detail in a minute, which we called a tiered protocol for endocrine disruptors. And there's 6 different levels, depending on how you count them. And so we have a website, and it's called TypeHead, this organization. And so let me tell you what we came up with. There are different tiers because there are different levels of actions that we can test these compounds as biological agents. The first tier at the bottom refers to the fact that we first look in the computer at the shapes of the molecules. You know, I told you a little bit about the shapes of the molecules and how they kind of look like each other. So we can actually do experiments in computer modeling to see if these compounds might look like, for instance, an estrogen, and might be expected to dock into a receptor. The next level up is we actually do test tube experiments where we look to see if these compounds will actually bind to one of those receptors that we usually find on cells. The next level up You see the receptors sitting on the surface of a cell. We actually do this in whole living cells and find out if we put that compound in, if it will cause a signal, a message from one cell to another, for instance. The next level up has an embryo, and that represents a fish embryo or a chicken embryo or a frog embryo, for instance. And so we do lots of experiments in those kinds of systems to see if these compounds might have effects in development. The next step up is looking at mammals. Mostly we do that in rats and mice. Sometimes there are differences between fish and frogs versus mammals. And so we also have to test them in in rats and mice usually. And finally, that last step on this tier is a symbol that represents getting compounds out of the earth once we've contaminated the earth with them. And this is where our chemists and biologists work together to design special molecules that can break apart the contaminants. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, this is I want to make several points with this slide that I didn't make with the previous tiered diagram. Mainly that these are the tiers again. As you go from the left to the right, you start with designing the chemical and going through these different kinds of tests. Those dollar signs up there mean that as you go up the ladder of the tests, they get far more expensive. So we have to think about that because there are hundreds and thousands of chemicals being designed all the time. How are we going to test them very cost effectively so that we can get our industrial partners to do this with us? And so if you have a whole lot of compounds, you might start at the left and do the computer modeling kind of thing. And then you can narrow the field of compounds you're developing. And then you go up to the next more expensive test, but you usually have to cover several levels to be sure. The fact that there's a plus sign in this red arrow at the bottom and at the bottom of each one of these levels of tests means that if you get a response that says, oh, this might be an estrogen, then you can follow that red arrow back to the redesign part, and you can go back and keep working with the chemist to tweak that molecule and redesign it so that it doesn't have an effect in any of these tiers. And so it's a reiterative process. Every time we find a molecule that has a positive response, we go back to the beginning and redesign it, and we keep doing that until we get chemicals that are not any longer estrogenic or mimic another hormone. So you can see that from putting our minds together, the power of this is that we understand both the economics of it and that we've been very comprehensive about all the integrated levels that a hormone works at in cells so that we can really be sure that it's not acting as a hormone in our bodies. So what about that level at the top where chemists and biologists dreamed up a way to actually break down these chemicals in the environment, because many of them are very persistent, and that's the problem. So this diagram shows a compound, a xenoestrogen, a foreign estrogen, and the turquoise entity at the bottom is what chemists designed to mimic the types of enzymes that are capable of breaking down these kinds of estrogenic molecules. So if the estrogen binds into this turquoise molecule, and the molecule, just as it does in an enzyme, if it twists, proteins often, that's how they work, they twist and make a conformational change, then it can break the xenoestrogen into two pieces, in this case, which can be then harmless products. So there's been a lot of design lately in trying to design these molecules that will actually break up these harmful products and that we could put in, say, into a resin or a tank in a water treatment plant and try to begin to break down some of these compounds. We're making progress on that, and that's probably one of the most hopeful things. Okay, so how are we going to go about this, making these tests available and convenient for people that invent new chemicals, and how are we going to spread the word about our plan? So our type head, our tiered protocol website, is an explanation of these tests and about the labs that do them and the mechanisms that they use. And we have several principles of design as we organize this. One of the things that we decided early on is that we didn't want to certify anyone, because the certifiers or organizations like the EPA or the FDA, and those guys get hung up in the regulatory system, and they're very, very slow. And we think we need much faster action. So we want to give information to people, not certify them. So we will identify the hazards and figure out appropriate and innovative ways to test for them and even remediate them. So our group's product is actually information and these organized tests and how you could interpret them, and we update it very, very frequently, which a government organization really cannot do. So our goal is to be much more efficient at reducing public exposures to these kind of chemicals in the future. We're trying, an example of one of the ways that we're trying to make this much more efficient is we're starting to use robots for some of these tests, and not exactly a robot like this, but a robot like this. And so there are all kinds of moving parts in this robot that put chemicals into test tubes and automatically assay them. And so with this kind of thing, which you can actually see, we have a YouTube video of this, we make the tests much faster and much cheaper, and that's one of the ways we hope we can have an effect. And so we're still in the business of organizing and focusing our ideas and our responses, and we're designing commentaries and putting them into talks like this one that I'm giving here. And we have written forums on journals and blogs and Facebook pages and on our website. And so we're trying to create an environment where we can all talk about this and share our results and debate about them. We even have a new journal called Endocrine Disruptors so that we can publish things about them. And so this is kind of where we are now. We are in progress. This is what we're trying to do. We're going to need some luck, and we're also going to need some federal dollars to try to develop these things. And we're in progress. So I hope this helped explain to you kind of where we are in the process of trying to remedy this situation. And I'd be happy to answer questions that you might have.
So if anyone has any questions of Dr. Watson, we'd be happy to hear your questions now. Let's see, Gentle Roan says, I believe some physics and mathematicians are doing something similar together. Oh, that may have been a comment during the presentation. Baragon bets, is there a concern that for a chemical to serve its industrial purpose that it will, I'm sorry, it faded away too soon, that it will inherently be a hormone disruptor because of its shape?
Well, certainly that's a consideration, and that's the reason we like this iterative process of continuing to tweak the molecule a little bit, because sometimes it's not only the shape, it's the parts that hang off of the basic shape. And so chemists can actually go back and tweak that, maybe put a different type of modification, and we can keep testing it and retesting it until we get one that will no longer, for instance, fit into a receptor. For instance, one trick people use sometimes is to add another big molecule that will not prevent the chemical from polymerizing, say, into a plastic, but will no longer let it fit into the receptor. So these are really important considerations, and that's the reason we have to test and redesign and test and redesign and keep doing it over and over again.
And a comment from Gentle, what a fantastic way to work together. Gentle says, I believe some physics, question, how many other types of chemicals should we be concerned about?
Well, certainly anything that's small enough to fit into a receptor is a candidate, I guess. But there are certain, it's not like everything in the world is contaminated with bad stuff. There are categories. And although it might seem like a lot of compounds, they are in certain categories that we know are the problem ones. And it really is a matter of our getting together and understanding each other and interpreting the tests for each other and helping with the redesign. I hope that answered your question, but the main message here is that we need to test them before we put them into a product, not after.
And Baragon said, is there a concern that for a chemical to serve... Oh, wait, we've already done this one. Claire asks, do you wash your hands after using plastic? Should we?
I wash my hands a lot these days. I try to avoid using plastic when I can. For instance, the kind of water bottle I use now is a metal one, a stainless steel one, or a glass one, and I fill my water bottles from the tap because at least the tap water is not having the plastic of the container leaching into it. But it's almost impossible for all of us to protect ourselves from everything. Certainly I don't heat up anything in a microwave in a plastic container because that causes even more of the chemical leach out. So it's a combination of thinking of the way we use things plus hoping that biologists and chemists will get together and design some new materials so that we don't have to worry so much about this.
And from Violet, she says, I'll second Gentle's other question. How common are endocrine disruptors in medical equipment and supplies?
Unfortunately, they're very common. Endocrine disruptors are often plastic molecules, not all plastics, but some plastics. And the kinds of tubes and packaging that we have for medical supplies are often contain these molecules that are the bad plastics. And so if you have someone in a hospital bed hooked up to all kinds of IVs, for instance, or machines that are pumping fluids through their bodies, then if those fluids are all running through plastic tubes, for instance, and the plastics are the kind that contain some of these molecules, that's a definite problem. And we particularly worry about premature newborns that are often treated with those kinds of medical practices, and they are very vulnerable because their hormones are just in the process of developing their bodies.
Should we go back to using animal type tubing, from their bodies? Would that be better than a plastic?
Like when we used to use animal sinews to do stitching, and we used to use things like gut that was cleaned out for tubing. I don't know whether we have to go back that far. I truly believe, I mean, certainly that those were then devoid of the plastics that we're worried about. But I do believe, since I'm now in a group of people that are talking to chemists, that we can redesign some of these chemicals. After all, not all plastics are bad in this way. So we just have to give some thought and some design to it so that we can come up with new molecules that aren't just as bad as the old ones, like the BPS with the BPA comparison, but ones that don't fit into the receptors that we're worried about anymore. And I think it can be done. Also, it's very promising that we're working with chemists on designing small molecules that break apart other molecules, and I think that's one of the most promising things.
Yeah, that kind of cuts it off at the pass.
Right.
What about, I'm thinking from a consumer point of view, I get those steamable vegetables in the bags. Is that dangerous?
I don't do that. Because it's a plastic bag. One of the problems with the plastic containers is they're required by law to tell you what's inside the container, the food item, right? Mm-hmm. But nobody is required by law to tell you what the components of the plastic are in the packaging. And I would snip those things out of the plastic bag and put them in a ceramic or glass container before I microwave them. Sorry, but that's my solution to the problem right now.
Well, that's what I've been doing anyway, but the steaming was nice for the
it was a really nice it was really a nice convenient idea, but until I'm sure that plastics are labeled appropriately and we've been able to test the ones that are in use, I'm not going to do that anymore personally anyway.
Right. Athena asks, so knowing all of this stuff is there, what safety things can we be doing, like avoiding those steamable bags?
Yeah, So I don't heat up things inside of plastic containers. I try not to buy liquids in plastic containers. I snoop around the grocery store looking for things that are packaged in glass, for instance, because glass is a really nice inert container. I know it breaks, and that's a hazard, but it there isn't anything leaching out of glass into the
Less of a
food.
hazard than, yeah.
And if you look nowadays, there are lots of things that used to come in tin cans. Tin cans is one of the biggest offenders here because there's a resin inside, and they actually put the food into the tin can while it's hot, and so it leaches stuff out of the resin. So I
Ah,
try not to buy anything in a tin can anymore. In fact, I look for things that are packaged, for instance, in cartons,
what about tuna
sometimes
fish?
in
Things
bags
like
that I can take them out of that they wouldn't have been put into as hot food. Um, so, those are the kinds of things you can think about doing while we work this out.
I've just bought
But
4 cans of tuna fish. Does that mean I need to throw it out?
these things are very, very long-term changes usually in
Yeah.
your hormonal profile. I will tell you that there was a very interesting study that was done on college students. They put them into two groups, and one group they fed out of food from tin cans, and the other group they bought fresh vegetables or frozen ones, for instance, or things that were packaged frozen instead of in tin cans. And in about 2 weeks' time, they had cleared BPA out of the system mainly for the students that had not eaten things out of tin cans.
Wow.
Um, what's interesting about this is that for BPA and compounds like that, it's different for different ones. Some of them accumulate in the body and stay there, other ones get broken down rather quickly. And actually, originally we thought BPA was going to be okay because the body does break it down and eliminate it fairly quickly. The problem now is that our environment is so chock full of it that we keep re-exposing ourselves over and over and over again, so we maintain a steady amount just from the exposures.
Yeah, I think they look at each little product and say it's only got this much, but when you add up all the other products you consume as well.
Well, and that brings up another point which I might not have made in my talk. Maybe I did a little bit. That these compounds are all out there at the same time.
Yeah.
So we're not experiencing one at a time like we're testing in experiments. In fact, we're trying to design experiments now to test. We start simple. I've been doing experiments with 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4 of these compounds together, um, and trying to build knowledge about how they actually work in combination because there are hundreds of them.
Yeah, the accumulative effect, right? So, I had another question. Oh, how can we get tested as individuals? Do our doctors have the
I don't
means to
hear you anymore.
test our chemical levels on these subjects?
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second there. Can you repeat your question?
Do our doctors, our physicians, do they have the test available to test us for toxic levels of these chemicals?
Not that I know of.
Ooh,
No, it's mostly scientists doing these tests. They do controlled studies where, the studies on BPS are very recent. Some people that were in the Department of Public Safety Water Department in New York did those tests. They gathered samples from urine and blood of people and found out that this BPS chemical, which was only introduced um, less than 5 years ago, is now in those urine and blood samples from people. So it's scientists doing these tests. I know of no kind of clinical test that physicians are doing. Just think how complex this is, how many different chemicals there are. So I guess that's the reason we decided that we thought it would be more effective to try to affect the process at the very beginning instead of focusing on how to test people for it, because we know from experiments in the laboratory that it can mess up endocrine signaling. We're focusing our efforts on figuring out how to redesign the chemicals so they won't do that anymore.
right, but it could help others with, lingering diseases, not understanding what's wrong with them, especially if their doctors aren't aware of this information either.
Right. And it's generally not into the realm yet of everyday doctors' appointments being able to test for these kinds of things. It's one of those things that you have to figure out where, with very little money for research in this area, where you can focus and funnel your resources to maybe do the most good.
Right. It's just a shame the physicians aren't aware of this, at all, so they could push on their end.
Well, they're like the public. They're aware of it probably to more of an extent than the public is, but I still don't think it's widespread.
Mm-hmm.
They of course understand how the body works, and so if you tell them about it, they will understand that if these things work like hormones in very tiny amounts, they'll know the significance of that. But if they don't have tests that are available that they can use on people very readily, and they, like us, are grappling with the idea of where do we stop it?
Right.
How can we have the biggest effect? One of the things that we're going to have to do is to convince manufacturers and industries to test chemicals that they're developing with biologists and chemists before they put them into products. And so one of the things we're talking about is how we could organize this at a national, even international level, so that industrialists would feel very comfortable coming to us and asking for these tests at the beginning of their development of a product, and then use that information to alter the development of products, because as we point out to them, they should want to stop having lawsuits about this, or they should, just from being human beings themselves, not want to be contaminated themselves, and they should want to avoid having to retool their industries when we find out about these things. So it's for their benefit as well.
Right. I think if the public was more aware too, that they could put pressure on those manufacturers. I think that's how we've gotten the whole message of parabens into the public realm. Is women especially, are becoming aware of how their shampoo can affect their estrogen levels
Right.
and stuff. I think that's going to be the big motivator, because it's sad to say, but manufacturers aren't very humanistic in their outlook. They have a product, they want to make a certain amount of profit, and that seems to be the overruling thing.
Yes, and retooling or settling lawsuits right now about products that are already there
Mm-hmm.
are really not a good part of their bottom line.
Right.
There's some really great comments and questions I'm glancing at,
Yes.
that I see coming through the chats here. This one that I see here, I'm sorry, I don't have enough room to make my chat screen really big, but I see this one from Gentle Heron about making exterior coatings instead of interior coatings. And that's one of the practical considerations that inventing ways so that the plastic doesn't come into direct contact with food is certainly something that people should start looking at. If part of this is the public needs to force the industry and government to start looking at these things and coming up with different solutions. The reason we line cans with plastic is because, if you're old enough, you may remember back in the really old days, food corrodes, especially the acid in food corrodes tin cans. If you ever remember leaky tin cans. And so this was an effort to make the products have a much, much longer shelf life. We need to come up with ideas about, could we put a coating on the outside of a can that would also result in it not corroding the metal? I don't know. Those are all interesting suggestions and things that everybody from the biologists and the chemists to the manufacturers and the engineers need to come up with answers for. But we need to, right now we're, I guess, in the mode still of raising public awareness so that you can demand these kinds of innovations.
Yeah, that was my idea behind the testing. If we could have solid proof that their products or the packaging of those products were causing us to get ill or at least put us at risk, that would put a lot of pressure on those manufacturers to change and help you all with your efforts to get them to turn to you for the solutions.
Here's the problem. Human beings have very, very long lifespans. And the science of figuring this out in humans is called epidemiology. And since humans are not very well controlled, you need lots and lots and lots of data to actually make these kinds of proofs of, or at least correlations.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have very long lifespans. You know, maybe something that happens to them when they're 6 months old doesn't have an effect until they're 60. That's one of the problems. So a long, long time. You know, you might get a cancer or something later in life, for instance. And they're not very controllable like we do tests in cells and animals. We can control the conditions. So you have to work out all of those other factors that might influence humans and make sure that they're not affecting your results. So humans are really tough, and of course, to figure out. And of course, most humans don't volunteer for experiments either. Not controlled
We
experiments.
don't even want them messing with the mice. So,
Yes, yes.
wow, this was really great discussion.
Super comments coming in here.
yeah.
I wish I could take some more of them.
See if I'm
Let's
missing
see.
any. Gentle says, also humans don't believe in the possibility of bad outcomes that have low incidences. The I am mortal syndrome.
Yes, part of human nature, I guess, also works against us here. And so you have to really have lots of proof before people will think that this is, especially something, for instance, like things that take so many years to develop. You know, some of the diseases we're talking about here, you know, low bone density, that might not catch up to you until you're in your 70s or something. So it's very, very hard to convince people that something they're doing when they're 20 might affect their bone density when they're 70. It's just that there's a not of an immediate connection between the actions of a lot of these chemicals. But there are other things like we're worried about their effects on fertility, for instance. That may be something that people might get a little bit more immediately in tune with if they're trying to have children and can't. Some of these chemicals can also affect things like fertility.
Wow. 4 years fierce heart. Sorry. I am 51 and have fibromyalgia and all sorts of other problems. I started menopause at 32. Wow. They
Wow.
say I'm not making estradiol anymore.
Estradiol?
Thank you.
Okay, okay. You know, in any, the problem with this is that we can't talk to any individual person and say, we know this caused your illness.
Right.
There's just no way to make that connection. The only way we can make it is by scientifically looking at very, very large groups of people and looking for correlations, or by doing experiments in cells or in animals to try to pin down that there's a cause-effect relationship. That takes a lot of years and a lot of money. That's the reason we're trying to emphasize now some of these more rapid tests that we can do in cells, so that we can make the connections quicker and try to resolve some of the connections between these chemicals and disease processes. But it's really tough. I'm sorry, but it's really tough for to talk about any individual and whether their disease may have been caused by something like this.
So the best thing we can do is spread the word to our children's children and get them to change the way they feed each other.
And support more research
Yes.
that comes up with the answers so that we can go after the people that are continuing, even after the evidence comes in, to use these chemicals in their products.
Yep.
But we have to have lots of research to pin that down.
Yep. So the big solution is early prevention, as most medical solutions are for us as individuals, and wait for you all to be heroes and come up with the solutions.
Come up with this, or even prove what the cause is.
Yeah.
In many cases, that's a tough one, and it takes a while to work that out.
And I assume they can't find a solution for the effects on us humans until they find out how to test us and see how it works in our bodies. And like most things, I'm sure there's a range of differences how everybody's body reacts to these chemicals
Yes.
because their
And one of the
DNA.
problems is the fact if you leave it to a government agency to come up with a law about it,
Yeah,
you know how we're doing these days lately on making laws.
yeah.
It's not happening very easily. So that's the reason we'd like to focus this on the information that we can provide and cause people to voluntarily change their actions instead of making a law, uh, which takes a long, long time and is very difficult to change their actions.
Well, I think that's about it, all the time we have. Well, thank you everybody so much for coming. I agree. This was a great presentation. I certainly learned things I didn't know about this stuff. And
Great to see this many people come and ask such good questions and make such good comments. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Okay, bye bye.